Side opposition would rather incentivize students to think that they can take their future into their own hands and present a fairer gauge for students' progress than champion a world in which, at its best, students will not be ready for the competitive working environment, and at its worst, a world that doubles down on the academic pressure on already struggling students. So proud to oppose. Rebuttals will be integrated into my speech. I'll flag them as I go. What is it that side opposition wants then? Opposition would rather emphasize the academic excellence's value. Higher grades have higher values. This looks like having distinctions like valedictorian, having letter grading rankings. This works as an incentive for students to work harder and put more effort into their studies. We think that proposition's best case is an ideal world in which studies are seen as a matter of simply passing, a mere prerequisite to graduating. What is our burden in this debate then? If we can prove how it's principally in line with the education system, and if this will harm students more in the long run, we win this debate. Firstly, then, on principle justification, there are three layers to this. Firstly, there's no urgency in the current status quo to do so. Panels, proposition's framing on the current status quo is misleading. I'll clarify with two main points of framing here. First, the reality of an average student's life is not so pressuring to the point where they would spiral into a depressive state constantly. Proposition's claim was that academic pressure is so stifling to the point where it causes students to not be able to pursue their actual passions, and it leads to mental health issues, so leniency is required. Three responses. A, we would say an average student still has plenty of time to self-actualize outside of school, right? They still have fun and play games. With more progressive teaching methods, such as lessening homework and grades taken from outside of just one final exam, we would say that there are now more options currently in status quo that help lessen academic pressure. B, school already facilitates hobbies and non-academic talents through extracurriculars and clubs, as well as being a place to make connections and relationships. If a student has clear passions and wants to train their specialty, then they should be going to schools that cater to that. C, most students in status quo feel that achieving true academic excellence, like getting into the top 20% of your grade with a perfect 4.0 GPA, is not a priority. Modern families are more lenient with their expectations for grades, and it seems like a pipe dream to an average person. Academic pressure in status quo, then, is what drives most students to perform better than average, with a C or a B as a prerequisite. Secondly, in the case that students feel the most unbearable academic pressure, like proposition assumes every student is going through, we would argue that these students are one of two scenarios. A, ambitious students who have a heavier workload because they choose to take it upon themselves. These students are most likely more privileged and have more self-motivation to overachieve. Therefore, they have consented to have more of an academic burden on them anyway. And B, students who are special needs who have trouble keeping up with their peers. We'll touch upon how it doubles down the pressure on them on proposition side in our practical substantive later. Therefore, valuing academic excellence actually creates an equilibrium in our status quo. The conclusion then here, panels, is that if proposition does remove that pressure by de-emphasizing academic excellence, the average student would be even more demotivated to study. Second layer then. Educational institutions are obligated to exert this pressure. The role of educational institutions in student lives is plain and simple, to prepare them for the working environment. Merely giving validation, as proposition says, is not enough, panels. That is not the world that we live in. Notice that in our hyper-capitalistic society, if you're not trained to withstand pressure from a young age, you will naturally crumble. The reality is that in the future, you will most likely not be doing a job you love. There are many aspects of life that no one will find passion in, like filing taxes, working an office job. The conclusion here then is that as educational institutions, acknowledging that the standardized subjects have flaws, the most valuable thing that we can provide to students is the ability to simply go through with tasks that we don't want to do, to endure and swallow that bitter pill in life, because inevitably it will happen. Of course, only a select amount of students can actually excel at subjects and achieve academic excellence, but the valuing of it means that we place value into putting work into every subject, which helps students with self-discipline. Third layer then, academic excellence is a good metric. In proposition's principle, they claim two things: that Excelling academically is heavily reliant on lottery of birth and externalities, therefore it's unfair to emphasize its value. We will say that it is exactly because of this lottery of birth, we need an extra incentive for those who have the short end of the stick. Notice, panels, that if the underprivileged situation is as helpless as proposition makes it out to be, then this is their only way out, right? We would rather make it seem like hard work towards a better letter grade is a viable option to give hope among the underprivileged that they do have some kind of agency in their lives. Secondly, they claim that valuing academic excellence inevitably favors logical subjects and is therefore unjust. It is true that subjects like art can't be measured exactly through just the lens of objectivity, but it wouldn't be deprioritized, as letter grading takes scores from an average of every subject. Hence, every subject has similar importance. Even if it were true, we would take this trade-off because at the end of the day, our goal is to instill this hardworking discipline among students, which is exactly what they need to survive in the real world. So why should you weigh this heavily then, panels? We've proven why validation is not nearly enough for the betterment of a student's future and how academic pressure in status quo is not as pressing as proposition paints it out to be. Therefore, their whole case falls. Second argument then on direct harms. There are two huge direct harms on their side of the house and a direct benefit on our side. Firstly, that academic pressure is worsened on their side for the most vulnerable. Let's put it into perspective how pass or fail grading will affect struggling students. It's much more humiliating to fail on proposition because the supposed bar is already so low for the students who are already struggling from learning disabilities or just not being able to keep up. This shame further discourages them, and the insecurity is twofold because people can double down and say that pass or fail systems are supposed to be more lenient, that these students didn't try as hard because they know that, etc. At the very least, on our worst case, this shame wouldn't be doubled down on the most vulnerable students. Secondly, students do not have a strong enough incentive to study seriously on proposition. Let's take them at their best. Let's characterize students here, panels. They're 1, flighty and uncommitted. 2, they haven't discovered themselves. 3, they're immature. Therefore, students are naturally uninclined to the discipline of studying. Their motivation only applies to the things that they have an interest in, as a child is probably only motivated to practice piano every day in the first week of getting it, and might want to move on to the next hit thing unless their parent tells them to commit. This exactly means, panels, that if they rely on internal motivation without that external pressure to study, they will not take it seriously. Proposition says that students will be more result-oriented on our side of the house, and they will resort to shortcuts in the learning process. However, we think that cheating will happen on both sides anyway because of what we explained. If you were to simply have to pass a class, but you hated it so much and you didn't pay attention because it wasn't interesting, then you would just make a quick cheat sheet because it's the easiest way out. At best, this is symmetrical. Comparatively then, on our side, when you emphasize the value of academic excellence, it serves as a check and balance to students' natural flightiness and develops the discipline of doing what's necessary even if they don't like it. For the sake of our students, proud to oppose.